What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend of debrief and effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts, Caleb Pearson. Joining me in the host spotlight, Mr. Mark Francis. MF, how you doing, brother?
What is up?
Good. Happy spring.
Happy spring.
It's exciting.
Happy Apple Blossom Week.
Yeah. Survived a middle school retreat.
Good for you.
I'm back.
Survive
I'm older.
is the key word.
I hope I'm wiser.
Yeah.
Got some sleep. So.
But give us the quick update. Did you see God work in their lives?
Yeah.
And
It's
it
the
was
best.
outreach focused, right?
Yes.
So they were able to.
Yeah, full weekend learning about
evangelism,
missional living, not just believing in the gospel, but articulating it. And then they actually write letters to friends back home to send out. So that's very exciting.
Cool.
But yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Good job. Praise the Lord. But he's joining us here on the podcast. Happy to have him, Tim Sanford. Tim, how are you?
Good. Doing great, man.
Thanks for being in the pulpit this past weekend.
You bet.
We're doing something a little bit different over the next 3 weeks, including this podcast we're covering this past weekend, just talking about spiritual warfare. But before we kind of explain that and elaborate on it, I'll come your way first. What stood out this weekend from our series in Mark?
Yeah.
And then we'll go from there.
I mean, from a worship team standpoint, it's always a little bit of a concern when you come off of an Easter weekend high. You know, you have all this build up of Good Friday service and Easter celebration, and people are excited, and there's the buzz around the building. But we do this 52 times a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
We gather.
Yep.
And so we want every weekend to feel like Easter, but it doesn't have the same presence. But it was exciting for me to still celebrate the resurrection with like an opening song and have some passages that do that. There's still I feel our church is growing in their engagement during the times of worship. And we've talked about this, but just you get that sense. And so that to me is exciting. So just from a worship team perspective, coming off of Easter, it's great to celebrate that.
Yeah.
And Tim, you alluded to that. But then the other thing for me, beyond what the sermon was that you opened your sermon by referencing these testimonial stories. And I really appreciate you highlighting that as well, of knowing that like we've been doing this for several weeks now. And many of you guys are giving your stories.
Yeah.
And it's helpful. It's really encouraging. There's something to seeing the practical applications of each person being worked out in their lives, either past or present, where they're following Jesus and trusting him and putting their dependency in him and learning more about him as they're growing and as they're following him. So you highlighted that, and then you alluded to the tub and toilet a couple different times during the sermon. But that helps, you know. It's like there's a practical application of a story of somebody from our congregation who was able to grow years ago and have God speak to her while she's sitting between a tub and a toilet.
Right.
So it is just I like how you're able to weave those in to the practical applications of the sermon.
Yeah, I was a little bummed that I didn't use that as a title, right? Like,
Yeah.
Between the tub and toilet.
Yeah.
People would have got that email on Friday and be like, I got to be there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, titling the sermon Mighty Messiah, I mean, it's our testimonial bumper as well.
Yeah.
What was it about recentering on the series title that was important?
Well, I was trying to highlight the difference between mighty and mighty Messiah, right? In that whole issue of need and are we looking to him just to be mighty in our life versus is he really truly mighty Messiah? And there's probably other phrases without having used that already. I probably would have picked something else to kind of highlight that. But I felt like by using that phrase, it keeps with the motif that we're talking about and what Mark is talking about in this, right? And keeps us going. And I felt like I could explain that well enough that people would kind of get it. And so that was it. A lot of times my titles are not like, I need a team around me who can really help me with a title, let me tell you.
Yeah. That's what the preaching team is for, right?
That's right.
Challenge each other in that way.
Yeah. Wow.
It's good. Yeah. And what is it about coming back from Easter and reorienting us on Mark, and then share with us a little bit, Tim, about why we're actually going to be departing the book of Mark for a couple weeks and then coming back to it?
Yeah.
Just kind of to refresh our...
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I said this towards the end there too, but it's interesting to me how many times already in such 3 short chapters that we've dealt with, can I say, the spirit realm, right? And so, of course, as we were talking and looking at some of this stuff and saying, look, there's a number of places where this shows up in Mark. We're not going to be done with it yet. So maybe we should pause and make sure that we've tried to lay some degree of foundational thought in there, so that as we come back to it in Mark, you're kind of planning that on a foundation, right? It's not a shaky foundation. It's not a wonky foundation. Hopefully, it's something that actually, no, this is what the Word of God says. So as I'm seeing this, it's going to fit in. And there's all kinds of things. We won't have time for this in Mark, but for example, it is interesting how much in the Gospels these kinds of things are being described. And then you move into the epistles and it's like gone, a vapor, disappears, right? Why? Is there significance to that? And does that affect me as a church believer now, looking at the Gospels, specifically Mark here, and studying that out? And does it impact the way that I think about that, the conclusions that I draw? And we've talked in our meetings some about the big word dispensations, right? Like the dispensation of grace, or the church age, had not started when Mark wrote this.
Right.
I shouldn't say when he was writing about, right? So what does that mean for us? Does it mean anything? And if it does, what does it mean for us? And there's some things like that that are going to have to be wrestled
I don't know
with.
if I'm going to be on these episodes in the next couple of weeks. So, I've got my own questions that people have been filtering to me, so I'm going to feed them to you even right now. What you're saying is true. Are there that many demon-possessed people running around the streets today, in the world today? And you don't have to answer these questions. These are just kind of prep. And are there difference between unclean spirits and a demon-possessed person? Because Mark goes back and forth between both.
Yes.
And the fact that the disciples were able to go out and Jesus empowered them with his authority to cast out demons.
Yes.
And they did that.
Yeah.
And then some people couldn't. There's just so many
And does that authority pass on to us today? And
exactly.
Yeah,
So
all of these
Those are my
things.
questions. It was just kind of I'll set you guys up, because there's just you read about it and you're like, oh yeah, demon possession, Jesus could just cast them out. Well, man, what does that look like? Some they actually gave scenes of, seems like seizures and epilepsy that look like it. And then there's other scenes that doesn't describe what the symptoms are. There's some scenes where it's like a mute spirit, and then there's another scene where a person couldn't see and talk, and it wasn't labeled as demon possession.
Yes.
So there's a lot of workings that I think you guys are studying through, and I'm excited to hopefully have you unpack some of
And
these
again,
things.
we'll have 3 weeks to talk about this, so we're having to be pretty
selective.
About what are we going to talk about, and what are foundational things, but to a lot of what you're even describing, there probably could be some benefit to having, whether it's a BTC class or whether we actually deal with this from the pulpit at some point in a more spread out environment where, I like the BTC environment because you can ask questions, but that also has an environment that brings up, it's an intriguing subject matter. It seems like that everybody kind of, we're either scared to death of it or we're really intrigued, and we kind of run to these ditches, so to speak, and you can easily get off track, I think.
But that wasn't necessarily the full topic of your sermon this past week.
Right. Yeah, that portion was more of a promo of what's to come here. No, but one of the things I was hoping we could talk about was this whole hinge point that I was mentioning there of, and I hope that was being communicated or understood. But, I thought, okay, so why is this a big deal? Why is it important for us as believers to understand that there's a door that's swinging, and I don't know if you want to say swinging open to closed or what, but it's moving in this. And as you look at it, one, for me, what it does is it helps me to know that this whole idea of the kingdom being closed and being offered later, right, is not an afterthought. It's not a God being disappointed that things didn't go his way, and so now I got to spool up plan B. It's not that at all. And we're seeing, at least I think, in the chapter that we're in, specifically, for example, like when he goes up on the mountain and then he chooses the 12, right? He chooses the apostles. Why is that being described to us? prior to the unpardonable sin, where that is the indication of, look, this has ended right here, right? Why is that being done in that order? I think it's because, well, obviously God knows all things, right? So he has implemented, and it's a genuine, God doesn't do anything that's fakery, right? It's a genuine offer, but also knowing that the nation is going to refuse him. And he knows what he's going to do as a result of that. And he is already implementing that, just like he had the boat following him back and forth. He already knows. He already knows what the situation is like. Scripture never describes that he needed the boat, but he had it there, right? Because he's an all-knowing God. So, to me, there's also a value in it that then as you go through the Gospels, I think as you talk to people about it, one of the things that seems to come up in people's minds is the parables. And it's kind of like, well, Jesus talks in parables. That's what we think, that from day one to end day, he always just talked in parables. And it's always like, well, they didn't understand him. How in the world am I supposed to understand him? So we kind of skip through some of these things. Maybe we're okay with not understanding. But if we recognize that, you'll see basically it's after that point of rejection that he now starts speaking in parables. And he continues to engage with people differently than he did before. Why? So that seeing they won't see, hearing they won't hear, right? Like understand in that kind of a thing. Because this generation, according to, and we'll maybe get into some of all this as we get into those portions, but this generation has refused him. That has crossed the line. It's not that there's not individuals within that generation who can turn to him for their salvation. Nicodemus, I think, is an example of a guy who did, right? Slowly, progressively came to know the Lord as, he is actually indeed the Messiah. And we see him showing up, with Joseph of Arimathea, right, at the end. So obviously individuals can put their trust in, but the nation has been set aside. And that helps us in our dispensational thinking as we go forward. That helps us in our consideration of what is he saying in these parables. Okay, so the reason behind those things are to veil a certain truth, right? That is then usually later explained to his disciples. So it's to me, it just helps me align. I'm seeing what I'm seeing, and that makes sense to me, as opposed to, what in the world? I don't know the big picture here, so it doesn't make any sense at all.
So if I can just clarify, at least where I'm hearing you talk about the hinge, is regarding the nation of Israel and God's covenant with the Jewish people.
Yes.
And so Jesus is first kind of talking to the Jewish people, his own people, and now there's this hinge where he's opening the door for the kingdom to the Gentiles. Is that what you're saying?
Not so much the kingdom to the Gentiles, but the church age.
The church age, yeah. Okay.
And the cross, right? He's headed to the cross now. That's always been the plan of God. Like he knew that before the foundation of the earth. But I think what we're seeing is in chapter 3 here, from 7 to 30, we're actually getting a picture of, we can actually see the door swinging. It doesn't mean that when it comes all the way around that he stops doing, he'll still do miracles, right? He's still presenting himself as the Messiah to them. The problem is that individuals are going, you're the Messiah, but the nation is not doing that. So their offer of the kingdom is not going to be, it's not on the table anymore. And it won't come back on the table until he actually says this, right? Like, until this nation receives me as their Messiah, this is not coming. Well, that will happen in the future. That'll happen after the church age, in fact.
And you also mentioned unforgivable sin. You said that here once right now. You said it in your sermon a couple times without really unpacking. That's a passage that's going to come up in the book of Mark.
That's right.
So we're going to get to it from a preaching standpoint, but it's very often misinterpreted.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Right.
So can you just whet our appetite a little bit about that? Because you're saying
I know
it
he's
in
teaching
context.
that, so
You're saying it in context that we know what you're talking about.
Right.
And so can you unpack that just a bit?
Yeah. So there was an intentionality in saying that, in part because of what you're describing, where there's so much, in my opinion, misunderstanding of that. So I've heard people talk about, well, I don't know what the unpardonable sin is, but I'm afraid that I might do that. And so I live in a certain amount of fear over an unknown, and that I can cross over a line. And then, hey, by very definition, you can't be pardoned by that, right? Like, so what does that look like? What does that mean? And of course, we know in the context there, and we'll see this as we get into the study, that they're attributing to Christ and his miracles and activities, they're attributing that to the power of Satan as opposed to the power of the Spirit of God, right? Mm-hmm. So blasphemy of the Spirit is another phrase that's being used there. And so they by doing that, that's an indication of we are not going to accept you as the Son of God. It doesn't matter what is coming at us. These guys are more bound to retaining their power than to losing it, right? Mm-hmm. And so they are not going to change. It's kind of like Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart. There it was. And so the Lord is going to, all right, we're going to go with that. And so it was unpardonable for that generation at that time. It is a unique situation that cannot be replicated, right? It's not going to happen again, and it's not available for you and I as believers to actually get into that. So we can breathe easy, but then we need to understand, well, what is it? And that's why then, the story makes sense. No wonder there's a change of, like I said, for parables, because this event has brought us to those things.
Which is helpful, too, because, again, the main idea here is following Jesus, knowing more about him. He's mighty Messiah, suffering servant. It helps clarify that, and this is something that comes up in youth ministry a lot, why is Jesus communicating in this veiled way? These parables are hard. Yeah. If God was supposed to be revealed in Jesus, why wasn't it easy? Why wasn't it black and white?
Right.
And you read the beginning of a lot of these Gospels, and it's kind of like it was black and white. He did things right in front of him.
Right.
But he's intentional with the parabolic teaching.
That's right.
And it's actually a reaction to their response. And so it's not that Jesus is holding out on us. It's that he's finding yet another way to fit into the rebellion around him. And all of that veiled meaning points to the cross, where a lot is undone. And so it's just, it paints a more vivid picture of the cross, I think.
And what it does for me personally, one of the things that it does for me, like it shows the long suffering of God, how he has patiently waited with these. I mean, you think back through the Old Testament and the ups and downs and the captivities and all of this kind of stuff, right? The silent years, all of this. And now here's the Messiah here. And he has just been so patiently telling these people what's going to be happening, offering it to them. They're right there. I mean, honestly, he gives every evidence that they should have easily said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, just like Peter did, right? That should have happened. And for him to be so long-suffering, and then, we'll get to this eventually, when he has been so brutally beaten that he is no longer recognizable. His relatives cannot look at him and say, oh, that's Jesus, right? The blob, if you will, of his face and of his body. And yet he's going out on the Via Dolorosa and he is weeping, or he's telling the women, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves, because in 40 years, basically, every rock on this mount is going to be torn down, and you're all going to be. And we know 1.1 million Jews were killed there because of the rebellion against Rome and how now they reacted. What a heart he has for them! He's going to the cross, and he's going to bear our sin, and yet he graciously. It's just a small little example of. He's a wonder is what he is to us, right? And he becomes more precious the more we learn of this heart about him.
And he's got it all covered. He does what he does on the cross. He is resurrected, and then even before he ascends, there's a helper given to us.
Yes.
And so we start to understand that as we encounter hard topics, or in this case, spiritual warfare, a topic that resonates with difficulty in our own lives, we can remember too, like, we don't have to be ignorant on it. Like, he is on top of things.
Right.
And we're not saying he has authority in a veiled, we're not going to be speaking in parables about spiritual warfare. None of that language.
Right.
The rest of the New Testament gets very practical for Christians. And I think for good reason, because we've been given everything, right, 2 Peter 1, pertaining to life and godliness. And the symptoms of spiritual warfare are when we start to question or wonder both of those things, my life and my godliness. And so it's so cool to see what biblical dependency will look like over the next 3 weeks as we talk about some of this heavy stuff.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your final application points Only because
Sure.
a lot of times when you get to the end of the sermon, you're like, oh, we got to wrap up. But then there's a couple of key important points there.
Yeah.
And just to see if you had any added thoughts of how do we apply anything that came out of the sermon this past weekend.
I mean, I'm usually not an individual who tries to have something right there at the end.
You're giving applications all throughout, which is great. So
all I was trying to do with that was kind of recapture those statements again. We've talked about these things over and over again, so I thought, well, if I can just put them into a little quick blurb for some people are visual learners, they see that, right? I'm saying it, whatever. But I think those things really are. I think they're important for us to wrestle with and to be, as we are growing and maturing, coming more and more to the conclusion: A, that God is to be glorified. And he's worth that. He's worth it more than what I even know, even as I glorify him. I continue to learn more and more about what he is worthy of, and it just blows our minds. And I think that'll be part of the journey of eternity as we go. But him to be lifted up and to be seen for who he is and to be glorified in our lives, that is valuable because it begins to inform the values that I have and the things that I think should be happening in my life. Now my promotion is not necessarily the primary, let's say at my job, right? Like my promotion is not the most critical thing in my life. What is more critical is that God, you be glorified in my life. So what if one of his kids doesn't get the promotion, but acts godly in a place where others who don't get their promotion up and quit, pitch a hissy fit, whatever? Is there a difference? How does the Isaiah, remember he talked about like he's not going to he's not going to quench that, right? Like, okay, if that's the very life of Christ that's going to be lived out in our bodies, right? Because we're yielding to the Spirit of God to live that out, then it's going to, in that context of like I'm passed over for promotion, it's going to be lived out in not a storming, hey, you guys owe me, da, 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 right? Like I'm demanding my rights. No, the life of Christ is looking like what Isaiah was describing, and that's what a believer should be looking like. And we say, well, what good does that do? Because maybe no one ever comes to us and says, hey, listen, you're a great testimony to me of godliness, right? That's not necessarily the point. The point is that we actually are, though, a testimony of godliness, and God says that that's glorifying to him, and God says he uses that for his own means. We can trust him for that. And then the other one is the whole maturing process. As we behold him and keep our eyes on him, and he's doing this work, and we're valuing his glory, we're being matured and we're growing. Some of that can be very self-centered, honestly. We want what we want for our own benefit, right? But there is also I think the Spirit of God working in our lives and in teaching us about the value of maturing. We know about this when it comes to physical life. We tell our kids, grow up all the time, right? Like as if somehow by saying that, we're going to force that to happen. It's foolish, but it tells you something about what our desires are, our expectations. And listen, if there's a 30-year-old guy who's acting like a 14-year-old guy, we're all going to be like, dude, you got to grow up, right? That's a problem for us. So we already understand the value that there is on that. The struggle, I think, is that it seems like the value of that in the spirit world, or spirit realm, the Spirit of God realm, is not as high as what it ought to be, maybe. And that's part of why I asked the question. If you had a need and there was a way you could push and shove and get that need met, what would that need be? Because I'm trying to help us to think through, listen, we've got to be thinking along the lines of spiritual growth, not apathetic, not complacent, not just drifting. And that doesn't mean we go to the other end either, and we're going to take the bit, in our teeth, and we're going to control all this, but more of a heart that, like, God, I want to partner up together with what you're trying to do. This is what your word says, and I want to have that same kind of heartbeat there and be born along with you in that process that you're doing in the maturing of my life. Because guess what it does? It flips back to number one and brings glory to God. How in the world can individuals we have our own problems, right? How in the world can we look back on 10 years and see growth in our life and not thank God and not glorify God for that? Because we're screwballing up here a little bit and paying the consequences, and we got scars to prove it, right? Like that's how that goes.
It's all part of the following process, all part of the journey of just hopefully you see that slow trajectory of growth as you are pursuing knowing God more.
And I'll say this I know we're going long here, but need is one of the main tools that brings this stuff to the surface, right? It's one of the main things that's being used. Now, we know this, or we're growing in our knowledge of that, but it's amazing, again, how much, even though we know it, we try to keep from having need, expressing need, admitting to a need, all of those things.
I'm not going to pray for, God, give me more needs.
Right.
In my life. Give me more problems. Give me more struggles.
Why would we do that? Because we have something within our makeup, sin, right, that we listen to the lie against all of that stuff. But I tell you, the more I know who I am in Christ, that begins to affect me so that I can actually tell you I had someone, afterwards, Sunday night said, hey, they really appreciated me, being vulnerable. And I appreciated that comment and that encouragement. But the reality is that that's normal, really, right? That's normal for us because God accepts me. I love that. I love the fact that he accepts me. So I am free to say things that other people might not accept me if I believe that he accepts me and I value that more than being accepted by others. I'm a man pleaser. Like, I just know that, right? I've lived life like that for a lot. So I know what that is like, and I know what it's like for God to be changing that to where, hey, son, is it what you guys think about me or what he thinks about me? Where's that at? And need now becomes, as that begins to change for us, need is not to be relished in. Woo, look at all my needs. Look at, I got all these things. But they are something to be delighted in the sense of rejoicing over the benefit of God bringing those to the surface for me is growth then and maturity. And then also it benefits. I don't know how many times I have said things about my own needs that God has then used that to get another person to come talk to me about the very same need in their own life. If I would have shut up, they would have never known it. They would have maybe hopefully found somebody else who could give them some insight maybe into that. But God gave me an opportunity because of that.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. Cool. Another thing that it does is needs help to produce humility in our lives. We cannot there, I just flipped the switch now, right? I went from pride to humility. That's a process. That's a work. And I've said this many times before. How can a proud person make themselves humble? You can't, right? But how many of us have been exposed to different needs in our own lives that it's like, so, right? Like, oops. Okay, Lord, now you're beginning to show me. And I start making choices that are consistent with humility rather than with arrogance over all that stuff. It's just amazing how the Lord works all of this. And
it's cool.
It's a lifelong thing, following Jesus.
Totally.
But will be cool to see what comes from the pulpit over the next couple of weeks as we talk about the unseen realm and spiritual warfare a little bit. It's exciting. But Tim, thank you for being here.
Yeah,
appreciate it, brother. Mark, you're the man. What can we point people towards?
Yeah, I'll just plug. So you were saying it's a 3-week series from the pulpit starting this weekend. But then if you view weeks 2 and 3, there's the correlating Biblical Training Center course that's happening at both 9 o'clock and 10:45. It is also about following Jesus, but in the battle, if you want to call it that, where it's going to be unpacking of Romans 6 through 8. Yeah. So you're going to have 2 opportunities during those 2 weeks to come to church, go to the class, go to the worship service, or go to the worship service and go to the class. Right. So just look for that, because I think that's going to be another opportunity to hopefully see some of the puzzle pieces get blended together. So that's the first thing to point people to. There's other upcoming summer activities and things that are going on already. The Global Church podcast is going to be having an episode drop this coming week, so you can learn about what students are going to be doing over in Africa. And yeah, we just want to hear from you guys. So keep sharing your testimonies.
Yep.
Keep them coming.
Absolutely. For all our listeners and viewers, that's exactly right. We love to hear from you. You can find us at fbcva.org/podcast. So if you have any questions, especially over the coming weeks, feel free to send them our way there. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to just take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.